You can't imagine what you're doing to me right now, a pregnant widow warns the mountain man. Snow falls heavy in the Colorado highlands. A lone mountain man drags a broken wagon from the road. Inside, a widow, heavy with child, clings to life. But when he carries her to safety, she turns on him with fire in her eyes. You can't imagine what you're doing to me right now. She swore never to trust another man. Yet in his lonely cabin, lamplight flickers, and a prayer rises. Then, the deputy rides in with railroad men at his side, debts in hand, and a spring worth fighting for. The law is against her. The town whispers. The baby is almost here. And in a world where widows are silenced and mountain men scorned, their only hope lies in a deed stolen and a truth no one wants to hear. But when the hour of judgment comes, will her warning become a curse or a promise of redemption? What happens when a widow's unborn child becomes the only thing standing between greed and justice? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The wind howled through the Colorado mountains, driving sheets of snow before it like a white curtain. Liam Hale's boots crunched through the fresh powder as he made his way along the familiar trail, his rifle slung across his back and a string of rabbits at his belt. The day's hunt had been good, though the threatening storm had cut it shorter than he'd planned. His thoughts wandered as he walked, as they often did on these solitary treks. The isolation of his mountain cabin suited him well enough most days. Up here, a man could live honestly before God without the complications that came with the town life. Still, on nights like this, when the wind moaned through the pines like a lost soul, the silence could weigh heavy. A sharp crack split the air, followed by a sound that didn't belong. Wood splintering, metal groaning, and beneath it all, a woman's cry. Liam froze, his hunter's instincts alert. The sounds had come from around the bend ahead, where the trail curved past a steep drop. He quickened his pace, rounding the bend to find a scene of destruction. A small wagon lay broken on its side, one wheel completely shattered. Supplies were scattered across the snow, sacks of flour, a trunk spilled contents, kitchen implements glinting dully in the fading light. Near the wreckage, a horse lay still, its dark coat dusted with white. But what seized Liam's attention was the woman huddled against the wagon's remains. She wore a heavy coat that couldn't quite disguise her condition. She was clearly with child and far along. Her face was pale, with cold and pain, dark hair falling loose from what had once been a neat bun. "Ma'am?" Liam approached slowly, not wanting to frighten her further. "Are you hurt?" She looked up at him with eyes that held more fury than fear. "Stay back," she warned, though her voice shook with cold. "The storm's getting worse," Liam said quietly. "My cabin's not far, let me help you." "I don't need your help." She tried to push herself up, but her legs buckled. "I can manage." Liam took in the situation with growing concern. The temperature was dropping fast, and night wasn't far off. In her condition, she wouldn't survive long out here. "Ma'am, I mean no disrespect, but you'll freeze to death if you stay here." She laughed bitterly. "And I suppose you're offering out of the goodness of your heart?" "I'm offering because it's right." Liam kept his voice steady. "Nothing more." A particularly fierce gust of wind cut through them both, and the woman, he could see her name Karen Briggs stitched on a fallen bag, wrapped her arms tighter around herself. "Please," Liam said softly, "let me help you to shelter." For a long moment she stared at him, searching his face, then another shiver racked her frame, and something in her seemed to break. "I don't have much choice, do I?" Without waiting for further argument, Liam stepped forward and carefully lifted her in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, despite her condition, and he could feel her trembling. "You can't imagine what you're doing to me right now," she said, her voice thick with something between anger and despair. "I swore never to need another man." The words held such pain that Liam's heart ached for her, even as he kept walking steadily through the deepening snow. He didn't try to argue or defend himself, Sometimes silence was the better answer. Instead, he did what he always did in moments of uncertainty. He prayed, his lips moving silently as he asked for guidance and wisdom. The storm grew fiercer as they made their way to his cabin, but Liam knew these trails like the back of his hand. Karen remained tense in his arms, but she'd stopped protesting, whether from exhaustion or resignation he couldn't tell. When they reached the cabin, Liam shouldered open the door and carried her straight to the hearth. The fire had burned low during his absence, but there were still hot coals. He set her down gently on the bearskin rug before the fireplace. "I'll build up the fire," he said, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Then I'll make you some broth." Karen watched him warily as he added wood to the fire and stoked it back to life. The flames cast flickering shadows on the cabin's log walls, highlighting the simple but solid furnishings. A rough-hewn table, a few chairs, shelves stocked with preserved foods and supplies. "Your belongings," Liam said as he moved to the kitchen area. "I won't touch them without your permission. Tomorrow, when the storm passes, I'll go back and salvage what I can from the wagon." He could feel her eyes on him as he worked, heating the broth he'd made from yesterday's hunting. The familiar tasks helped steady his own thoughts. It had been a long time since he'd had anyone else in his cabin. Longer still since he'd had a woman here. The responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders. When the broth was hot, he poured it into his best cup, which wasn't saying much, being tin rather than china, and brought it to her. "It's not fancy, but it'll warm you up." Karen took the cup with hands that still trembled slightly. "Thank you," she said, the words sounding like they cost her something to say. Liam nodded and moved back, giving her space. The storm outside grew louder, wind rattling the shutters and driving snow against the windows. They were sealed in together now, whether they liked it or not. As Karen sipped the broth, her eyes grew heavy. The warmth of the fire and the ordeal she'd been through were clearly taking their toll. Liam brought her his spare blanket, clean, if somewhat worn. "You should rest," he said. "The bearskin's warm and you'll be safe here." A flash of that earlier bitterness crossed her face. "Safe?" she repeated. "Don't make promises you can't keep, Mr. Hale. I've learned the hard way about trusting men's promises." The words hung in the air between them, sharp as icicles. Liam accepted them without argument. She had her reasons for that mistrust, he was sure. Instead of responding, he simply nodded and moved away, settling himself on his knees beside the hearth. As Karen drifted into an uneasy sleep, Liam remained there, his head bowed in prayer. "Lord," he whispered, so quietly the wind nearly drowned it out. "Grant me wisdom. Show me how to help this woman without adding to her burdens. And, please..." He glanced at her sleeping form, noting the worry that lined her face even in rest. "Please, help her find peace." The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin there was only the crackle of the fire, the soft sound of Karen's breathing, and the whispered prayers of a man asking for guidance in an unexpected situation. The night stretched ahead, long and uncertain, but for now at least, they were both safe from the cold. Liam kept his vigil by the fire, knowing that trust, like warmth returning to frozen limbs, would take time and patience. He could only pray he'd be equal to the task God had set before him. Morning crept into Liam's cabin like a cautious visitor. Pale light filtered through the gaps between the logs, painting thin stripes across the rough wooden floor. Karen stirred beneath the warm blankets, her mind slowly rising from the depths of exhausted sleep. The first thing that reached her consciousness was the rich, homey smell of cooking oatmeal. She lay still for a moment, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly as she took in her surroundings. The events of the previous day came rushing back. The accident, the snow, the mountain man who'd carried her to safety. The fire had burned down to glowing embers during the night, but the cabin was still reasonably warm. A steady thunking sound from outside drew her attention. Pushing herself up carefully, Karen made her way to the nearest window. Frost had created delicate patterns on the glass, but through a clear spot, she could see Liam Hale at work in the yard. He was splitting logs with methodical precision, his breath visible in the cold morning air. She noticed how he kept his back to the cabin, never once glancing toward the windows. The deliberate way he avoided looking made her realize he was trying to give her privacy, even in this small way. The pot of oatmeal hung near the banked coals, giving off tendrils of steam. Beside it sat a wooden bowl and spoon, clearly set out for her use. Karen's stomach growled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten properly since yesterday's broth. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air as Liam entered with an armload of split wood. He nodded to her without meeting her eyes. "Morning, Mrs. Briggs. Breakfast is ready when you are." He moved to stack the wood near the hearth, his movements careful and contained despite his large frame. "I can serve myself," Karen said quickly, her voice coming out sharper than she'd intended. "Never doubted it," Liam replied quietly. He straightened up, brushing wood chips from his coat. "I need to check my trap lines. Will you be all right here for a spell?" Karen lifted her chin. "I managed on my own before yesterday, Mr. Hale. I expect I can manage a few hours now." He accepted this with another nod and gathered his gear. Before leaving, he added more wood to the fire and filled the water bucket. "If you need anything." "I won't," she cut him off. After he'd gone, Karen moved around the cabin, taking stock of her situation. Her muscles ached from yesterday's ordeal, and several bruises had darkened overnight. She examined them carefully, grateful that none seemed serious enough to threaten her pregnancy. Still, she couldn't help worrying about the baby, her hands constantly returning to her belly to feel for movement. Her thoughts turned to her horse and wagon. She needed to assess the damage, see what could be salvaged. The snow had stopped, though drifts still piled high around the cabin. Wrapping herself in her coat, Karen made her way outside. The morning air bit at her face as she trudged through the snow to where her poor horse lay. Tears pricked at her eyes as she stroked its cold neck. The animal had served her faithfully, and now it was gone, like so much else in her life. The broken harness lay half buried in snow. Good leather, but cracked beyond any hope of repair. "I'm sorry about your horse," Karen startled. She hadn't heard Liam approach. He stood several paces away, respecting her space even as he offered sympathy. "I didn't mean to speak so harshly earlier," she said, surprising herself. "It's just—" "No need to explain," Liam interrupted gently. "You've got your reasons for caution. I respect that." He moved past her to examine the wagon. "Most of your supplies should be salvageable once we dig them out. The wagon itself—" He shook his head. "That wheel's beyond fixing, and the axle's cracked clean through." "I can see that for myself," Karen snapped, old bitterness rising again. She didn't need another man telling her what she could and couldn't do. Liam backed away, hands raised slightly. "Of course you can, I'll leave you to it." He turned and walked back toward his trap lines, his shoulders straight despite her sharp words. Karen watched him go, feeling a mixture of guilt and frustration. His quiet acceptance of her anger was somehow harder to bear than if he'd argued back. She spent the next hour salvaging what she could from the wagon, though the cold eventually drove her back inside. The day passed slowly. Karen kept to herself, sorting through her recovered belongings and trying to plan her next steps. Liam returned in the late afternoon with 2 rabbits and went about preparing them without comment. She noticed how he always announced his movements, how he never came too close without reason. As evening approached, she observed him laying out furs and blankets near the door. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making my bed," he replied simply. "You'll have the bunk." When she started to protest, he added, "It's warmer up there, and better for your condition." The arrangement made sense, but his consideration unsettled her. She was used to men who took what they wanted, who saw her needs as secondary to their own. Her late husband had been that way, for all his charm and promises. Supper was rabbit stew, rich with root vegetables from Liam's stores. Before eating, he bowed his head and spoke grace aloud for the first time since she'd arrived. "Lord, we thank you for this food, for shelter from the storm, and for watching over the widow and the child she carries. Guide us in your wisdom. Amen." The simple prayer caught Karen off guard. He hadn't asked her to join in, hadn't made a show of his devotion. There was just quiet sincerity in his words, and something about the way he'd included her child in his thanks made her throat tight. She ate slowly, watching him from beneath her lashes. He was nothing like the rough mountain men she'd known before. There was a gentleness about him that seemed at odds with his size and strength. His respect for her boundaries was so careful, so consistent that it was beginning to crack something in her carefully maintained wall of suspicion. Later, as the fire burned low and Liam's steady breathing told her he slept in his place by the door, Karen lay awake in the bunk. One hand rested on her belly, feeling the subtle movements of the child within. "Maybe," she whispered, so quietly even she could barely hear it. "Maybe we're safe here for now, little one." The admission felt dangerous, like opening a door that might never fully close again. But as she drifted off to sleep, she realized it was the first time in months she hadn't felt the need to stay alert for danger. Outside, snow continued to fall softly, adding another layer to the drifts that kept them isolated from the world. Inside, two souls, one trusting, one learning to trust, rested under the same roof, while the fire cast its warm glow over them both. The mountain weather showed its first signs of mercy after 2 long days. The endless curtain of snow finally lifted, revealing a crystalline world beneath a pale blue sky. Sunlight sparkled off the drifts that had sealed them inside Liam's cabin, transforming the landscape into something that looked almost magical. Liam noticed Karen standing at the window, one hand pressed against the glass, the other resting on her swollen belly. Her face held a yearning expression he recognized, the look of someone who'd been confined too long. "Might do you good to get some fresh air," he suggested carefully, keeping his voice neutral. "If you're feeling up to it." Karen turned to look at him, hesitation clear in her features. "I suppose a few minutes wouldn't hurt," she said finally. "The baby's been restless today." Liam nodded and retrieved her coat from where it hung near the fire. He held it out, letting her take it herself rather than trying to help her into it. Over the past days, he'd learned to read the subtle signals that told him when his assistance would be welcomed and when it would make her bristle. The cold hit them like a physical force when they stepped outside. The snow reached past their knees, but Liam had spent the morning clearing a path around the cabin. Karen moved carefully, her balance altered by her pregnancer, hurrying crunched in the fresh snow as she took her first tentative steps. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her words forming little clouds in the frigid air. "I'd almost forgotten what the world looked like without snow falling." They made their way slowly along the cleared path. Liam stayed close enough to help if needed, but far enough to give her space. The strategy worked until they reached a particularly icy patch. Karen's foot slipped and she stumbled slightly. Without comment or hesitation, Liam's hand shot out to steady her elbow. Just as quickly, he released her once she found her footing. The fact that she didn't immediately pull away or snap at him felt like progress. They stood in companionable silence, watching their breath mist in the air. A jay called from a nearby pine, its harsh cry echoing in the stillness. Karen wrapped her arms around herself, not entirely from the cold. "My husband," she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "He died in a saloon brawl." The words seemed to surprise her as much as they did Liam. 6 months ago. They said he was cheating at cards, but knowing Thomas, he was probably just drunk and running his mouth. Liam kept his eyes on the distant mountains, giving her the privacy to speak without feeling watched. When she continued, her voice held a bitter edge. "He always did love his whiskey more than anything else, more than our land, more than me. Certainly more than this baby he never knew about." She pressed a hand to her middle. "I thought I could handle whatever debts he left behind. I was wrong." Liam listened, letting the weight of her words settle in the crisp air between them. He didn't offer platitudes or press for details she wasn't ready to give. His silence seemed to give her permission to speak what had been bottled up inside her. "The mining camp failed," she continued, "but not before Thomas borrowed money from half the men there, and the storekeepers in town." She shook her head. "I didn't even know about most of it until after he was gone." Before Liam could respond, a sound cut through the winter quiet. Hoofbeats approaching through the snow. Karen tensed immediately, her face going pale. Liam moved slightly closer, not touching her but making it clear he was there if needed. The rider came into view around the bend in the trail, a man in a deputy's badge and a too-new coat, sitting his horse with the kind of arrogance that spoke of borrowed authority. His smile, when he spotted them, held no warmth. "Well now?" Deputy Cray called out, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that made Liam's jaw tighten. "Ain't this cozy? The Widow Briggs taking up with a mountain man?" He swung down from his saddle, boots crunching in the snow as he approached. "State your business, deputy," Liam said quietly, but there was steel beneath his calm tone. Cray ignored him completely, focusing instead on Karen with a smug grin. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "Got something here you'll want to see, Mrs. Briggs, though I reckon you know what it's about." Karen's fingers trembled slightly as she took the notice, but her voice remained steady. "I have a right to read this inside, Deputy Cray." "By all means," Cray gestured toward the cabin with exaggerated courtesy. "Lead the way." Inside, Karen sank into a chair at the rough-hewn table, unfolding the paper with deliberate care. Liam moved to stand near the hearth, keeping Cray in his peripheral vision. The deputy made a show of looking around the cabin, his lip curling at the simple furnishings. "It's all here in black and white," Cray said, clearly enjoying himself. "Your late husband's debts to the miners and storekeepers. Quite a sum when you add it all up. Course, if you can't clear it." He shrugged, the gesture anything but casual. "That little cabin of yours in town and the land it sits on? Well, somebody's got to make things right." The color drained from Karen's face as she read, but her spine remained straight. "These amounts? Some of these can't be correct. I need time to—" "Time's about run out, ma'am," Cray cut her off. "Railroad's coming through. Land's worth something now. Folks want their debts settled." Liam stepped forward. "The law allows for witnesses to speak on her behalf. These claims should be properly—" Cray's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Mountain men don't count as witnesses, Hale. You know that as well as anyone. Law needs respectable folk, not some hermit who barely comes to town." His eyes swept the cabin again, contempt plain on his face. "Though I can see why you might want to speak up for the widow here. Cozy little setup you've found yourself." Liam's hands clenched at his sides, but he kept his voice level. "You've delivered your notice, Deputy. I suggest you ride on before the weather turns again." "Oh, I'm riding," Cray said, adjusting his gun belt with deliberate meaning. "But I'll be back, Mrs. Briggs. You can count on that." He directed one last sneering look at Liam before stepping out into the snow. They listened to the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. When they could no longer hear them, Karen seemed to collapse in on herself, her shoulders shaking. The notice slipped from her fingers to the table. "It's over," she whispered. "Everything I've worked for, everything I saved. That cabin was all I had left. Where will we go?" One hand pressed protectively against her belly as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. Liam moved slowly to the table, giving her time to reject his presence if she chose. When she didn't pull away, he carefully placed his large, calloused hand over her smaller one where it rested on the rough wood. "The Lord ain't finished with your story yet, Mrs. Briggs," he said softly. "Don't you go thinking he is." For the first time since he'd found her in the snow, Karen didn't resist the comfort of his touch. Her fingers trembled beneath his, but they didn't withdraw. A tear fell onto their joined hands as she fought to steady her breathing. The fire crackled in the hearth, throwing warm light across their faces. Outside, clouds were beginning to gather again, promising more snow to come. But in that moment, something shifted between them. A tiny crack in the wall of Karen's defenses, a small step toward trust. They sat in silence as the light began to fade, their hands still joined on the table, while the weight of Cray's threats and Karen's uncertain future hung in the air around them. Yet somehow, in the midst of her fear and despair, Karen found herself drawing strength from the steady presence of the quiet man beside her, and the unwavering faith in his gentle words. Dawn broke pale and cold over the mountains. Liam stood at his cabin door watching frost crystals dance in the early light. Behind him, Karen stirred restlessly in her bunk, her sleep troubled since Cray's visit the day before. The mule was already hitched to the sled, steam rising from its nostrils in the crisp air. "Mrs. Briggs," he called softly, "if you're ready, we should start for town while the light's good." Karen emerged from the cabin wrapped in her shawl, her face drawn with worry. "You don't have to do this, Mr. Hale. I can manage." "No need to manage alone," he interrupted gently. "Roads are icy, wouldn't be right letting you make this journey in your condition." He gestured to the sled, where he'd arranged hay bales and blankets to make a comfortable seat. She hesitated, one hand resting protectively over her swollen belly. "The townfolk. They'll talk." "Folk always talk," Liam said simply. "Won't change what needs doing." After a moment's consideration, Karen nodded. Liam helped her onto the sled, tucking warm buffalo robes around her legs. The morning air bit sharp and clean as they set out, the mule's hooves crunching through frozen snow. The journey was slow-going. Every jolt of the sled over rough patches made Karen wince and clutch her middle. Liam noticed and guided the mule carefully around the worst spots, though the icy road left them few smooth options. They passed the morning in comfortable silence, broken only by the creak of harness leather and the mule's steady breathing. As the sun climbed higher, Karen pulled her shawl tighter. "I never thanked you properly," she said quietly, "for taking me in that day." Liam kept his eyes on the trail. "No thanks needed. Any God-fearing man would have done the same." "No," Karen said, her voice bitter. "They wouldn't have. Most men I've known would have." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Never mind. It doesn't matter now." The town came into view early afternoon, smoke rising from chimneys against the winter sky. As they approached, faces appeared in windows and doorways. Whispers followed their progress down the main street. Widow Briggs riding with that mountain hermit, a poor thing reduced to such company. I could look at him, wild as a bear. Liam's expression remained impassive, though Karen saw his jaw tighten slightly. They pulled up in front of her small cabin, and Karen's heart sank. A heavy padlock secured the door, its new metal gleaming mockingly in the winter sun. "They didn't waste any time," she whispered, her voice thick with humiliation. Several townsfolk had gathered to watch, keeping a careful distance but making no effort to hide their curiosity. Liam helped her down from the sled, his strong hands steady and respectful. "We'll need supplies before heading back," he said quietly. "Might as well visit the general store while we're here." Karen nodded numbly, and they made their way down the boardwalk. The store's bell jangled as they entered, and conversation instantly died. The storekeeper's wife pursed her lips disapprovingly, while several men lounging near the pot-bellied stove barely concealed their smirks. As Karen moved toward the dry goods, she overheard fragments of resumed conversation. "Railroad surveyor in town yesterday. Looking at that stretch behind the widow's place, I do. Perfect spot for a spur line," he said. "Mighty convenient timing, wouldn't you say?" Blood rushed to Karen's cheeks. She grabbed what supplies she could afford and hurried to the counter, aware of every eye upon her. Liam appeared at her elbow, adding coffee and sugar to her purchases. When she started to protest, he shook his head slightly. "My cabin, my provisions," he said quietly. "Won't hear argument on it." Outside, Karen took a shuddering breath of cold air. "Just one more stop," she said. "There's something I need to check." She led the way behind her cabin to a small barn. Inside, half hidden beneath old hay, sat a battered trunk. Karen's hands trembled as she opened it. Liam watched her rifle through the contents. Old clothes, letters, a few books. Her movements grew increasingly frantic until she stopped suddenly, her hand hovering over an empty space in the bottom of the trunk. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Tears burned in her eyes as she stared at the vacant spot where important papers had once lain. Her husband's mining claims, property deeds from last spring, all gone. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. The railroad's sudden interest, crazed smugness, the missing documents. Liam noticed her distress but asked no questions. He simply stepped forward and lifted the heavy trunk. "This coming with us?" Karen nodded, quickly wiping her eyes. "Yes, please." They loaded the trunk onto the sled while whispers continued to circulate around them. Karen held her head high, though her heart was heavy with fear and suspicion. As Liam helped her back onto the sled, she caught sight of Deputy Cray, watching from the sheriff's office doorway, that same knowing smirk on his face. The journey back to Liam's cabin seemed longer, each bump and jolt a reminder of how far she'd fallen. The trunk rode behind them like a coffin of lost hopes. Karen sat rigid under the blankets, one hand pressed to her belly where the sun had already dipped behind the mountains when Liam's sled finally returned to his cabin. The day's journey had left them both exhausted, and Karen's face was drawn with more than just physical weariness. Liam helped her down from the sled, noting how she trembled despite her attempts to hide it. Inside the cabin, the familiar scent of pine logs and wood smoke wrapped around them. Liam quickly built up the fire while Karen sank into a chair, her hands absently stroking her rounded belly. The trunk from town sat like a shadow in the corner, a reminder of all they'd discovered that day. "Let me fix us some supper," Liam offered, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Been a long day." Karen nodded, but her mind seemed far away. As Liam moved about the cabin, preparing a simple meal of beans and cornbread. She stayed lost in thought, staring into the dancing flames. Finally, as he set a steaming cup of coffee before her, she spoke. "There's something I need to tell you, Mr. Hale." Her voice was quiet but determined. "About why those papers matter so much." Liam settled into his chair, giving her his full attention. The firelight cast long shadows across his weathered face as he waited patiently for her to continue. "My husband," Karen's fingers tightened around her cup. "Before he died, he filed claim papers for a spring just outside town. Good water, clean and steady even in drought. He showed me the documents, proud as could be." She paused, swallowing hard. "But after his death, I never saw those papers again. They should have been in that trunk with everything else." "And without proof of claim," Liam stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Without proof anyone could take it," Karen finished bitterly. "That water could mean everything to whoever owns the land around it, especially with a railroad coming through." Liam's eyes narrowed slightly. Mighty convenient timing, those papers going missing just when the railroad's showing interest. "My thoughts exactly." Karen set her cup down with trembling hands. "But what can I do? It's my word against theirs, and I'm just a widow with debts." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Liam's mind worked over the problem, remembering snippets of conversation he'd overheard on his infrequent trips to town. "There's been talk," he said slowly, "among the trappers who come through, about miners keeping important papers in an old shack up by the ridge, using it as a sort of secret strong room." He met Karen's startled gaze. "Could be worth checking once the weather breaks." "You'd do that?" Karen's voice held equal parts hope and suspicion. "Why?" "Because it ain't right what they're doing to you." Liam's voice was firm. "The Lord sees justice, even when men try to hide it." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but suddenly gasped, her hand flying to her belly. Liam was on his feet instantly, concern etched on his features. "Just a kick," Karen assured him, though her face had paled. "Strong one. Caught me off guard." She started to rise but swayed slightly. Without thinking, Liam stepped forward and took her hand, placing it against his chest to steady her. For a moment, they stood frozen in that position, his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her palm. "Easy now," he murmured, "no need to rush." Karen slowly regained her balance, but the moment had shifted something between them. When she finally pulled her hand away, it wasn't with her usual haste to avoid contact. Instead, there was a thoughtfulness in her expression as she studied his face. The rest of their evening meal passed quietly, but the silence had changed. It was no longer taut with Karen's suspicion, but rather filled with shared purpose. Liam served the simple food without ceremony, yet Karen noticed how he made sure she had the larger portion of cornbread, the warmer seat by the fire. As the evening deepened, Liam cleared away their dishes and added more wood to the fire. The familiar routine had become almost comfortable over the past few days. When he knelt for his evening prayers, as he did every night, Karen didn't turn away as she usually did. "Lord," Liam's deep voice filled the cabin, "we ask for your guidance in these troubled times. Show us your truth in hidden places. Bring light to what's been kept in darkness." He paused, and Karen could hear the genuine emotion in his words. "Watch over this household, Lord. Give us wisdom to see your path and courage to walk it." Karen lay in her bunk, eyes closed but very much awake. The words of his prayer echoed in her mind, stirring something she'd thought long buried: hope. Despite herself, despite all her bitter experience had taught her about trusting others, she found herself wanting to believe in this quiet mountain man's promise of help. The fire settled with a soft crack, sending shadows dancing across the cabin's walls. Karen opened her eyes to find Liam arranging his bedroll near the door, as he had every night since bringing her here. The respect in that simple act, the absence of any demand or expectation, spoke louder than words. "Mr. Hale," she said softly. He paused in his preparations. "Yes, Mrs. Briggs. Thank you for today, for everything." She hesitated, then added, "For caring about what's right." Liam was quiet for a moment. "Get some rest," he finally said, his voice gentle. "Tomorrow's soon enough to figure our next step." Karen settled deeper under her blankets, one hand resting protectively over her child. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf called to the rising moon. But here, in this simple cabin with this unexpectedly honorable man, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. The tentative stirring of trust. The missing papers, the threat to her future, the plotting of powerful men. All these still loomed large. But as she drifted toward sleep, Karen found herself holding on to Liam's prayer like a lifeline. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was still hope for truth to come to light, for justice to prevail. And perhaps she wasn't as alone in this fight as she'd thought. Dawn painted the Colorado mountains in shades of pearl and gold as Liam prepared for his journey. The fresh snow lay deep and pristine, unmarked except for the tracks of winter creatures. Inside the cabin, he moved quietly, not wanting to wake Karen, who still slept in the bunk near the hearth. He pulled on his heaviest wool coat and checked his rifle, making sure the action worked smooth despite the cold. His weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as he secured his snowshoes and packed his satchel with dried meat and a tin of coffee. Karen stirred just as he was reaching for the door latch. "You're going now?" she asked, her voice still thick with sleep. "Best light for tracking," Liam answered softly. "Should be back before full dark." She pushed herself up, one hand bracing her back as she stood. "Let me at least fix you something hot before you go." "No need," he said, but Karen was already moving toward the stove, her movements slower but determined. "Least I can do," she insisted, stirring the banked coals to life. "It's bitter cold out there." While she heated coffee, Liam checked his supplies one final time. The silence between them felt different now, less guarded, more companionable. When Karen handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed briefly. "Be careful," she said quietly. "Those men, they won't take kindly to someone poking around their business." Liam nodded, understanding her concern. "The Lord watches over fools and mountain men," he said with a slight smile. "I reckon I qualify as both." He drained the coffee and handed back the cup. Karen stood in the doorway as he stepped out into the crystal morning, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "I'll be praying," she called after him. Liam lifted a hand in acknowledgement, then set off through the deep snow. His snowshoes made a soft swishing sound with each step, the only noise in the still morning air. Behind him, smoke rose straight up from the cabin's chimney into the cloudless sky. The ridge lay 4 miles to the north, a hard journey through untamed country. Liam kept a steady pace, his breath frosting in the air. The sun climbed higher, but provided little warmth. Around midday, he paused in a grove of snow-laden pines to eat some dried meat and scan the landscape ahead. The abandoned miner's shack perched like a broken tooth near the top of the ridge. As Liam approached, he moved more cautiously, watching for signs of recent visitors. The snow around the shack lay undisturbed except for rabbit tracks, but he still approached with his rifle ready. The door hung crooked on its hinges, groaning as he pushed it open. Inside, the single room was dark and musty. Liam's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in the scattered debris, broken tools, rotting blankets, empty bottles. In one corner stood a heavy iron strongbox, its lid secured with a padlock. It took an hour of searching before he found what he sought, a loose floorboard near the back wall. Beneath it lay a metal document box, green with corrosion. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of papers. Some were badly water-stained, but still legible. Liam's heart quickened as he recognized official stamps and signatures. He was carefully rewrapping the papers when a sound outside made him freeze, the crunch of snow under boots. Liam eased back from the window, watching through a gap in the boards. 2 men on horseback passed below the shack, heading toward town. Neither glanced up at the abandoned building, but Liam waited a full 30 minutes after they'd passed before emerging. The journey back seemed longer as afternoon shadows stretched across the snow. His boots were frozen stiff, his shoulders aching from the cold and exertion, but the weight of the papers in his satchel drove him forward. He thought of Karen waiting, of her unborn child's future hanging on these water-stained documents. Back at the cabin, Karen had spent the day in restless activity. She'd tended the fire, swept the floor, prepared a thick stew of dried meat and beans, but her thoughts kept straying to Liam, imagining him moving through the vast whiteness of the mountain winter, Her lips moved in constant prayer as she worked, asking protection for this quiet man who'd risked himself to help her. The sun was setting when she heard the scrape of snowshoes outside. Karen rushed to open the door, relief flooding through her as Liam stepped inside. His beard was rimed with ice, his shoulders dusted with snow, but his eyes held a gleam of triumph. "You found something?" she breathed, helping him remove his frozen coat. Liam nodded, carefully extracting the bundle from his satchel. Karen's hands trembled as she unfolded the oilcloth by lamplight. The papers inside were wrinkled and stained, but the official seals were clear. Land claim documents bearing her husband's signature and the county stamp. "The spring deed," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You actually found it." Her fingers traced the familiar signature, remembering how proud her husband had been that day. "They can't take it now. My baby will have something, after all." She looked up at Liam, really seeing him perhaps for the first time. This mountain man who'd brought her in from the storm, who'd respected her fears, who'd risked himself to recover her future. Without thinking, she reached for his hands, clasping them tightly. "Thank you," she said fervently. "I don't know how to thank you enough." A smile transformed Liam's weathered face, reaching all the way to his eyes. Something warm stirred in his chest, an emotion he'd thought long buried in his solitary life. Karen smiled back, open and genuine, no trace of her usual wariness. "Supper's ready," she said, reluctantly releasing his hands. "You must be frozen through. Come, sit by the fire." Over bowls of steaming stew, they talked more freely than they had before. Liam described his years of trapping in the high country, the peaceful solitude he'd found in these mountains. Karen spoke of her childhood in Ohio, of the hymns her mother used to sing while working in their kitchen garden. "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing" was her favorite, Karen recalled, humming a few bars softly. She'd sing it morning and night, said it kept her heart turned toward heaven. "My ma favored Amazing Grace," Liam offered quietly. Used to hear her singing it while she mended by candlelight. The evening deepened around them, but neither seemed eager to end their conversation. The cabin felt different now, warmer, more intimate. No longer just a shelter from the storm, but something closer to a home. The found papers lay on the table between them, a symbol of hope restored and trust rewarded. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady. Inside, the fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Karen's face glowed in the lamplight as she described her mother's flower garden, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. Liam found himself watching her, noticing how animation had replaced the drawn worry of recent days. When she finally rose to bank the fire for the night, Karen paused beside Liam's chair. "I judged you wrong when we first met," she said softly. "I'm grateful the Lord sent you to find me in that storm." Liam looked up at her, seeing the firelight reflected in her eyes. "Reckon he knew what he was about," he answered simply. Karen smiled again, that new unguarded smile that seemed to warm the whole cabin. "Reckon he did at that," she agreed. And for a moment they just looked at each other, sharing the quiet certainty that perhaps God's hand had guided their meeting after all. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold as Liam stepped out to harness the mule. His breath misted in the crisp morning air while he checked the leather straps with careful attention. The journey to town would take several hours, and he wanted no mishaps with Karen in her condition. Inside the cabin, Karen wrapped the precious deed papers in oilcloth, tucking them securely into her shawl. Her hands trembled slightly, but determination showed in the set of her jaw. When Liam returned to help her into her coat, she managed a small smile. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded, one hand resting protectively over her rounded belly. "As I'll ever be." Liam had arranged fresh straw and blankets in the sled bed, making it as comfortable as possible. He lifted Karen carefully, settling her among the blankets before taking his place at the reins. The mule's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they set out, following the winding trail down toward town. The morning was bright and still, broken only by the jingling of harness bells and the steady creak of the sled runners. As they descended, the deep snow gradually thinned, giving way to patches of bare ground. Around mid-morning, Liam pulled up in a sunny clearing to rest the mule. "Might be good to stretch a bit," he suggested, helping Karen down. She walked carefully, working the stiffness from her legs while Liam spread a blanket on a fallen log. From his pack, he produced a cloth-wrapped loaf of bread and a tin of coffee, still warm from the morning's fire. Karen settled beside him on the log, accepting a thick slice of bread with genuine appetite. "First time I felt truly hungry in weeks," she admitted, watching as he poured steaming coffee into 2 tin cups. "Mountain Air'll do that," Liam replied, pleased to see color in her cheeks. They ate in companionable silence, sharing the simple meal. A jay scolded from a nearby pine, making Karen laugh, a sound Liam hadn't heard before. It transformed her face, chasing away the shadows of grief that usually lingered there. "Reminds me of my little sister," she said, still smiling. "Always chattering, that one was." "You miss her?" Liam asked gently. Karen nodded, breaking off another piece of bread. "Every day. But she's got her own family now, back east." She paused, then added softly, "Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed there too." "The Lord has his reasons for leading us where he does," Liam offered. "Yes," Karen agreed thoughtfully, "though sometimes his path seems mighty strange." They shared another quiet smile, understanding passing between them. The morning sun warmed their faces as they finished their coffee, neither feeling the need to rush. Back on the trail, the sled moved steadily toward town. Karen found herself studying Liam's profile as he handled the reins, the quiet strength in his bearing, the gentleness in his weathered hands. So different from her late husband's restless energy and sharp movements. As they approached the outskirts of town, the atmosphere changed. People stopped to stare as they passed, conversations falling silent. Karen felt the weight of judgment in their eyes, a pregnant widow riding into town with a mountain man. She sat straighter, lifting her chin. Outside the general store, a cluster of well-dressed ladies drew back, whispering behind gloved hands. Their disapproval was plain in every gesture. Liam kept his eyes forward, but Karen saw the slight tightening of his jaw. The courthouse stood at the center of town, its wooden steps worn smooth by years of boots. Liam helped Karen down from the sled, staying close as she navigated the steps. Inside, the clerk's office was warm and dim, smelling of dust and ink. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up from his ledger. His gaze moved from Karen to Liam, his lip curling slightly at the trapper's worn buckskins. "May I help you?" he asked, addressing Karen while pointedly ignoring Liam. "I need to register this deed," Karen said firmly, unwrapping the spring claim documents. The clerk took the papers with obvious reluctance, examining them through narrowed eyes. "These are quite damaged," he observed. "And filed rather late, wouldn't you say?" "They were misplaced after my husband's death," Karen explained. "But the claim is legal and properly witnessed." The clerk shuffled through the papers with exaggerated slowness. "There are certain outside interests to consider. The railroad has plans for water rights in this region." Liam's hands clenched at his sides, but he held his peace. Karen stepped forward, her voice steady but polite. "The claim predates any railroad surveys," she insisted. "Please just register the deed." The clerk sighed heavily, making a show of consulting other documents. Minutes stretched into an hour as he raised one objection after another. Liam remained silent, though Karen could sense his growing frustration. Finally, with obvious disapproval, the clerk raised his stamp. "I'll register it," he said, bringing the stamp down with unnecessary force. "But don't think this settles everything. That spring is already under review for railroad use. These things have a way of working themselves out." The threat in his words was clear. Karen gathered the newly stamped papers, her hands steady though her heart raced. "Thank you for your time," she said with dignity. Outside the courthouse, a group of children playing marbles stopped to stare at Liam. One boy pointed at his fur-trimmed coat, giggling. "Look at the wild man," he called to his friends. "Bet he lives in a cave." Before Liam could respond, Karen turned on them, her eyes flashing. "That man is worth 10 of your fancy townfolk," she declared sharply. "He's a Christian gentleman who helps those in need, while others stand back and judge." The children fell silent, shamefaced. Their mothers hurried them away, shooting scandalized looks over their shoulders. Liam touched the brim of his hat to Karen, his eyes warm with gratitude. The journey back to the cabin was quieter, both of them processing the day's events. The sun was setting by the time they arrived, painting the snow-covered peaks in deep gold. Liam helped Karen down from the sled, his hands gentle and sure. Inside, he built up the fire while Karen prepared a simple supper. The familiar tasks felt comforting after the tensions of town. As darkness gathered outside, Karen settled in her chair by the hearth, one hand resting on her belly. Softly, almost unconsciously, she began to hum, an old lullaby her mother had sung to her. The melody filled the cabin, sweet and clear. Liam paused in his work, listening with quiet reverence to the ancient tune of comfort and protection. The fire crackled low, casting warm shadows on the log walls. Outside, an owl called into the gathering night, but inside the cabin, there was only the gentle sound of Karen's lullaby and the peaceful sense of being home. The mountain morning dawned crisp and clear 2 days after their visit to town. Karen stood at Liam's cabin window, watching sunlight sparkle off fresh snow while she kneaded dough for breakfast biscuits. The peaceful scene shattered as 3 riders appeared on the trail, their horses' hooves breaking through the crusty snow. Her hands stilled in the dough. "Liam," she called softly, "we have company." Liam moved to the window, his expression darkening as he recognized Deputy Cray's swagger. Behind him rode 2 well-dressed men she didn't know, their tailored coats and polished boots marking them as city folk. "Railroadmen," Liam muttered, reaching for his rifle. "Best stay inside." But Karen wiped her hands on her apron and stepped toward the door. "Number, this concerns me and my child. I'll face them." Liam nodded slowly, respect flickering in his eyes. He positioned himself on the cabin's small porch, one hand resting near his holstered pistol as the riders approached. Deputy Cray dismounted first, his boots crunching in the snow. His customary smirk widened as he took in Karen's flour-dusted apron and Liam's protective stance. "Well, ain't this cozy?" he drawled. The widow and the mountain man playing house. The 2 railroad men dismounted with less grace, struggling to keep their fine boots clean. The taller one stepped forward, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Mrs. Briggs," he said smoothly, "I'm Mr. Fitch of the Western Pacific Railroad Company. This is my associate, Mr. Dahl. We've come to discuss your situation." Karen lifted her chin. "My situation?" "Yes." Fitch pulled a leather folio from his coat. "We've reviewed your husband's outstanding debts. Quite substantial, I'm afraid. The miner's claims alone exceed $300. "That's not possible," Karen protested. "Jack never borrowed." "The documents are quite clear," Dahl interrupted, his voice clipped. "However, we're prepared to be generous. In exchange for the spring rights, the railroad will assume all debts. You'll be free to start fresh elsewhere." Liam's hand tightened on his rifle. "That spring's registered in her name, legal and proper." Deputy Cray spat into the snow. "Nobody asked you, mountain man. This here's town business." "I live on this mountain," Liam countered quietly. "That makes it my business." Fitch's polite mask slipped slightly. "Sir, you're squatting on unclaimed land. Perhaps you should consider your own precarious position before interfering in legal matters." "He's not interfering," Karen said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He's protecting what's right." She placed one hand protectively over her swollen belly. "That spring belongs to my child, not to you." The railroad men exchanged glances. Dahl stepped forward, his facade of civility cracking. "Mrs. Briggs, don't be foolish. That water will serve hundreds through the railroad. You can't possibly manage the property alone, in your condition." "She ain't alone," Liam said softly. The steel in his voice made Deputy Cray's hand twitch toward his gun. Fitch's face darkened. "Very well, if you insist on being difficult, we'll pursue other channels. The court takes a dim view of widows who consort with squatters while refusing reasonable offers." He turned to Cray. "Deputy, note their belligerent attitude. We may need to file additional charges." "Already noted," Cray said with obvious satisfaction. "Might need to bring the sheriff up here. Make sure everything's proper." They mounted their horses, Fitch pausing to deliver a final warning. "Think carefully, Mrs. Briggs. The railroad cannot be stopped by one woman's stubbornness. We'll return with papers that will make your claim worthless." Karen stood straight-backed until the riders disappeared down the trail. Only then did her legs begin to shake. She clutched her belly, feeling sharp pains of distress. Liam caught her before she could fall, his strong arms guiding her to a chair by the fire. "Easy now," he murmured. Deep breaths. They'll take everything, she whispered, tears threatening. The spring, the land, my child's future. Oh, Liam's voice was firm. They'll not take it while I breathe, but we need to be ready. He studied her face carefully. Can you handle a rifle? Karen wiped her eyes. Papa taught me, but it's been years. Time to remember. Liam retrieved his spare rifle from above the fireplace. I'll not have you defenseless if trouble comes. Though her hands trembled, Karen let him guide her through the loading process. He showed her how to measure the powder, pack the wadding, and seat the bullet properly. Take your time, he instructed. Steady hands make true shots. Karen tried to protest. I don't want to hurt anyone. Neither do I, Liam agreed quietly. But sometimes showing strength prevents worse trouble. He helped her sight along the barrel, adjusting her grip. Besides, the Lord expects us to protect what's right. They practiced until her arms ached, Liam patient with every fumbled reload. As afternoon faded toward evening, heavy snow began falling, thick flakes swirling past the windows. The dropping temperature drove them inside, where the fireplace cast warm light against the gathering gloom. Karen prepared their evening meal mechanically, her thoughts churning with the day's confrontation. Liam seemed to understand her need for silence, speaking only to offer thanks before they ate. The cabin felt different now, no longer just a refuge but a fortress against gathering threats. Their quiet meal was punctuated by the crack and pop of burning logs and the soft whisper of snow against the windows. Outside, darkness settled over the mountain like a heavy blanket. But the cabin glowed with firelight, a beacon of warmth and resistance in the winter night. Karen watched the flames dance, one hand resting on her belly where her child kicked restlessly. Beside her, Liam cleaned his rifle with methodical care, his presence solid and reassuring. Though no more words passed between them, their shared resolve filled the cabin, a determination to protect what was right, no matter what storms gathered on the horizon. The newly loaded rifle stood ready by the door, a silent testament to the gravity of their situation. Yet somehow, its presence brought not fear, but a grim comfort. They were prepared now, for whatever might come. Snow continued falling outside, adding another layer of isolation to their mountain sanctuary. But within the cabin's walls, the fire burned bright and steady, much like the quiet strength that had begun to grow between its inhabitants, a strength that they would surely need in the days ahead. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows, casting long shadows across Liam's cabin floor. Karen sat at the rough-hewn table, her fingers drumming restlessly against the wooden surface. The confrontation with the railroad men yesterday had left her feeling caged despite the cabin's sanctuary. She watched Liam gathering his gear for morning chores, his movements steady and practiced. The familiar sound of his boots on the plank floor somehow both comforted and agitated her. I'm coming with you, she announced, pushing herself up from the table. Liam paused, concern crossing his weathered features. The path's icy, and in your condition, I can't sit here all day wondering if those men will return. Karen reached for her shawl, wrapping it tight around her shoulders. I need to do something useful. Ain't wise to strain yourself, Liam cautioned, but seeing the determination in her eyes, he nodded slowly. We'll start with the closer chores then. Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. Karen's boots crunched through fresh snow as she followed Liam to the water barrel. Her breath came in white puffs, matching the rhythm of her careful steps. I'll fetch the water, she insisted, reaching for the bucket. At least let me… Liam started, but Karen had already grasped the handle. The weight of the filled bucket made her arms tremble, but she lifted it anyway, water sloshing over the rim. Each step back to the cabin was a battle against her ungainly balance. Liam walked beside her, hands ready to catch the bucket if needed, but respecting her need to manage alone. By mid-morning, Karen had helped stack firewood, though each log felt heavier than the last. Her back ached fiercely, but she pressed on, ignoring Liam's concerned glances. The physical work helped quiet her churning thoughts about the railroad men's threats. The afternoon sun had begun its early winter descent when they heard hoofbeats approaching. Karen tensed, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. Liam reached for his rifle, but relaxed slightly as a familiar figure emerged from the trees. An elderly Cherokee woman rode toward them on a sturdy pony, her gray hair bound in a thick braid. She wore a mix of traditional dress and settler clothing, with a medicine pouch hanging at her waist. Her dark eyes missed nothing as she surveyed the scene. "Auntie May?" Karen breathed in relief, recognizing the respected midwife from town. Liam stepped forward to help the older woman dismount, though she managed quite capably on her own. "The Miller family sent word you might need my help," she said, her voice warm but direct. "I see they were right." Karen felt tears threatening. Just the sight of another woman, especially one known for her wisdom and healing, broke through some of her careful control. "I'm grateful you've come." "Let's get inside," Auntie May said, noting Karen's pallor. "You've been pushing yourself too hard today." Inside the cabin, Liam built up the fire while Auntie May unpacked her bundle of supplies. Her gnarled fingers sorted through packets of dried herbs with practiced efficiency. The familiar scents of raspberry leaf and chamomile filled the air as she prepared tea. "Drink this," she instructed Karen, passing her a steaming cup. "It will ease the aching in your back and help the baby settle." Karen sipped obediently, the warm liquid soothing her throat. Liam moved quietly around them, hanging Auntie May's cloak to dry and providing an extra chair. "Now then," Auntie May said, settling herself by the fire, "tell me what's troubling your spirit. The baby feels your worry." The story spilled out of Karen, her husband's death, the debts, the threatening railroad men, and her fear of losing everything. Through it all, Auntie May listened intently, her weathered face showing both compassion and understanding. When Karen finished, the older woman was quiet for a moment, stirring the fire with a stick. "You carry a heavy load," she finally said, "but you're making it heavier by refusing help." "I don't want to be a burden," Karen protested. "I've already imposed on Liam's kindness." "Stop." Auntie May's voice was firm but gentle. "Strong women endure not by standing alone, but by knowing when to trust. The Creator gives us community for a reason." She glanced at Liam, who had been listening silently from his place by the door. "Some are sent to help carry our burdens." Karen followed her gaze to Liam, seeing how he'd positioned himself protectively between them and the door, even in this moment of peace. Something shifted in her chest, a softening of her rigid self-reliance. "The town is stirring with trouble," Auntie May continued, her tone growing serious. "Those railroad men have been asking questions, spreading stories about you both." She turned to Liam. "Guard her closely, some men let greed poison their hearts." Liam nodded gravely. "No harm will come to her while I'm breathing?" "Good." Auntie May reached into her medicine pouch and withdrew something that caught the firelight. "This is for you, child." She pressed a small object into Karen's palm, a beautifully beaded charm on a leather cord. Intricate patterns of blue and white beads formed a protective symbol. "My grandmother made these for expecting mothers," she explained. "The beads carry prayers for safety and strength. Wear it close to your heart." Karen's fingers closed around the charm, feeling its solid reality. "Thank you," she whispered, emotion making her voice rough. They shared another cup of tea as Auntie May gave Karen instructions for the weeks ahead: which herbs to drink, how to rest properly, signs to watch for as her time grew near. The older woman's practical knowledge helped settle Karen's fears about the birth itself. As evening deepened into night, Auntie May insisted on sleeping in her own small tent outside, despite their protests. "I prefer the stars," she said simply. "Besides, you need your rest." Karen lay awake long after the cabin grew quiet, watching Liam check the door latch yet again. His broad shoulders moved methodically as he worked, replacing worn leather strips with fresh ones. The soft sounds of his careful work filled her with an unexpected sense of peace. Her fingers found the beaded charm at her throat, warming it with her touch. Something Auntie May had said echoed in her mind. The Creator gives us community for a reason. Looking at Liam's solid presence, she realized that for the first time since Jack's death, she felt truly safe. The night pressed cold against the window panes, but inside the cabin was warm with shared purpose. Karen placed one hand on her rounded belly, feeling her child move beneath her palm. The other hand still clutched Auntie May's charm, its beads smooth and reassuring against her skin. Whatever troubles the railroad men might bring, she was no longer facing them alone. Dawn arrived with frost glittering on every branch. Karen woke to find Auntie May already mounted on her pony, ready to return to town. The older woman's dark eyes were kind but serious as she gave final instructions. "Remember what I said about trust," she told Karen. "It's not weakness to accept help from those the Creator sends." She glanced meaningfully at Liam, who stood respectfully nearby. Sometimes strength comes in unexpected forms. Karen clutched the beaded charm, watching until Auntie May's figure disappeared among the trees. Behind her, Liam resumed his work on the door latch, each strike of his tools steady and sure. The morning sun caught his profile, highlighting the gentle determination in his features. In that moment, Karen felt the last of her defensive walls begin to crumble. She was tired of carrying everything alone, tired of fighting her need for help. Whatever dangers lay ahead, she knew now that facing them together was not surrender, it was wisdom. The charm warmed against her skin as she turned back to the cabin, ready to face another day in their shared sanctuary. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady, while inside, the fire crackled with promise of warmth yet to come. The winter wind howled outside Liam's cabin, but inside, warmth and routine had settled into a gentle rhythm. Karen sat near the fire, her nimble fingers working with scraps of fabric she'd salvaged from her trunk. The pieces were modest, faded calico, worn flannel, and bits of soft muslin, but under her careful hands they transformed into tiny garments for the baby. Liam watched her work as he cleaned his rifle by the window. The quiet industry of her sewing brought a homely comfort to his cabin that he hadn't known he missed. The firelight caught the silver thread of her needle as it dipped and rose like a bird in flight. "My mother taught me to make do with whatever the Lord provides," Karen said softly, holding up a small gown she'd pieced together. She could turn flour sacks into Sunday dresses that looked store-bought. Liam set his rifle aside. "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. Karen's hands stilled in her lap. Every morning, rain or shine, she'd read from her Bible and sing hymns while she worked. Said it kept her spirit lifted through hard times. She smiled at the memory. Even when the crops failed or father took sick, she never lost her faith. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow fell in thick, lazy flakes, adding to the drifts that already reached halfway up the cabin walls. "What about your people?" Karen asked, threading her needle again. "You never speak of them." Liam was quiet for so long that Karen thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low and thoughtful. "Not much to tell. Parents died when I was young, raised by my uncle, good man, taught me tracking and trapping." He paused. "There was a girl once in a settlement east of here. Thought we'd marry." Karen's hand stilled again. "What happened?" She chose another, a shopkeeper with clean hands and proper manners. Liam's smile held no bitterness, only old acceptance. After that, the mountains seemed like better company than townfolk. Until now. Karen's question hung in the air between them. Before Liam could answer, a knock at the door made them both start. It was Auntie May, bringing more herbs and checking on Karen's progress. The old woman's visits had become regular, a bridge between their isolated cabin and the wider world. Later that evening, after Auntie May had gone, Karen noticed a tear in Liam's coat hanging by the door. Without thinking, she took it down and began to mend it. "You needn't trouble yourself," Liam protested, but Karen shook her head. "It's no trouble, besides you've done so much for me." She worked steadily, her stitches neat and even. When she held the coat out to him, their hands brushed. A current of awareness passed between them, and Karen felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Much obliged," Liam said softly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. They both looked away quickly, suddenly conscious of how close they stood. The moment shattered at the sound of horses approaching. Liam moved swiftly to the window, rifle ready but not raised. Through the gathering dusk, he could make out several men on horseback near the ridge. Their fine coats and surveying equipment marked them as railroad men. Karen joined him at the window, her hand instinctively finding his arm. "What are they doing?" "Marking land," Liam said grimly, laying out where their track might go. His finger tightened on the rifle's trigger guard, but he didn't lift the weapon. You could drive them off, Karen whispered. They're trespassing. Liam shook his head slowly. Violence breeds violence. I've seen too many good men ruined by reaching for a gun when patience might have served better. He guided Karen away from the window. True justice isn't always fought with bullets. Karen studied his face in the dim light, seeing beyond the rough beard and weathered features to the quiet strength beneath. This was a man who had chosen solitude not from bitterness, but from principle, who had learned that power lay in restraint as much as action. The railroad men moved on after a while, their lanterns bobbing like fallen stars along the ridge. Karen and Liam sat by the fire, the tension slowly easing from their shoulders. Tell me more about your mother's hymns, Liam said, finally stoking the fire. It's been a long time since I heard proper singing. Karen smiled and began to hum softly, her clear voice rising to fill the cabin with remembered comfort. Liam closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him like gentle rain. Days passed in this way, each one adding another thread to the fabric of their shared life. Liam would set out at dawn to check his trap lines and hunt, bringing back rabbits or grouse for their pot. Karen kept the cabin, sewing and preparing for the baby, her movements growing heavier as her time drew near. In the evenings, they talked more freely. Karen spoke of her childhood on a small farm, of helping her mother tend a kitchen garden and learning to read by lamplight. Liam shared tales of his years in the mountains, the beauty of summer meadows above timberline, the loneliness of winter storms, the peace he found in wild places. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts while the fire burned low. Karen would work on her sewing while Liam whittled or mended traps. The quiet between them held no awkwardness now, only a growing awareness of how their separate paths had led them to this shared shelter. One evening, as Karen struggled to thread her needle in the failing light, Liam quietly moved his chair closer to share his lantern's glow. The small gesture, one of many such kindnesses, touched her deeply. She looked up to thank him and found him watching her with that same quiet intensity that both thrilled and unsettled her. I never thought to have company through these winter months, he said softly. Never thought I'd want it. And now? Karen asked, her heart beating faster. Before he could answer, they heard horses approaching again. This time, Liam's movement to the window was protective rather than aggressive. The railroad men had returned, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air as they discussed grades and water rights. Karen watched as Liam's hand tightened on his rifle, then deliberately relaxed. His face showed the struggle between righteous anger and chosen peace. In that moment, she understood that his restraint came not from weakness, but from a deep well of faith. Faith that justice would prevail without violence, that God's timing was better than man's. She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. You're a good man, Liam Hale, she whispered. He covered her hand with his own, rough palm warm against her skin. Together they stood in the shadows, watching until the railroad men moved on, their threats and schemes powerless against the quiet strength of two hearts choosing trust over fear. The baby kicked then, as if sensing the moment's importance. Karen laughed softly, breaking the tension. She guided Liam's hand to her belly, letting him feel the strong movement beneath. Life goes on, she said simply. Despite their schemes and our fears. Liam nodded, his touch gentle as he withdrew his hand. The Lord provides, he said, echoing her mother's faith. In his own time and way. That night, as the fire burned low and snow continued to fall, Karen lay awake in her bed, listening to Liam's steady breathing from his pallet near the door. She thought about how her desperate flight from town had led her here, to this unexpected sanctuary with this unexpected man. Her mother had always said that God's greatest gifts often came disguised as trials. Perhaps this winter of waiting, of sharing stories and silence with a gentle mountain man, was proof of that wisdom. Whatever the railroad men planned, whatever challenges lay ahead, Karen knew she was exactly where she needed to be. Outside, the wind sang through pine boughs heavy with snow, while inside, two hearts beat in peaceful rhythm, each discovering that solitude need not mean loneliness, and that strength could be found in surrender to grace. Morning light filtered through frost-covered windows as Liam pulled on his heavy coat. The cabin's warmth had made the leather supple again, though patches of wear showed at the elbows and cuffs. He checked his rifle and powder, then began gathering empty sacks for supplies. Karen watched him from her chair by the fire, anxiety written across her face. Her hands moved restlessly over her swollen belly, as if trying to soothe both herself and the child within. "Please don't go," she said softly. "We can make do with what we have." Liam shook his head, his movements deliberate as he checked his saddlebags. Flour's nearly gone, and we're down to the last pinch of salt. Winter's far from over. He glanced at her with gentle concern. "You need proper food, especially now." "The railroad men are watching the trails," Karen insisted, struggling to rise from her chair. "And Deputy Cray has no cause to stop me buying supplies." Liam helped her up, his large hands steady and sure. "I aim to be back before sunset." Karen gripped his sleeve, her fingers white-knuckled against the worn fabric. "I have a bad feeling about this, Liam. Those men, they're not bound by law or conscience." "The Lord watches over his own," Liam said quietly. He covered her hand with his for a moment, then gently disentangled himself. "Keep the door barred. I'll knock 3 times when I return." Karen followed him to the door, watching as he mounted his mule. The morning air bit sharp and cold, making her pull her shawl tighter. "Be careful," she called as he turned toward the trail. Liam touched his hat in acknowledgement, then urged his mount forward. Soon the trees swallowed him, leaving Karen alone with her fears. The day stretched endless before her. She tried to keep busy, sweeping the cabin floor, mending clothes, preparing a stew for Liam's return. But her thoughts kept straying to the dangers that might await him in town. The railroad men's threats echoed in her memory, mixed with Deputy Cray's sneering contempt. By mid-afternoon, Karen had worn a path in the floorboards with her pacing. She paused often at the window, searching the trail for any sign of movement. The winter light began to fade early, painting long shadows across the snow. The first gunshot made her jump. It echoed faintly from the valley, followed by 2 more in quick succession. Karen pressed her hands to her mouth, stifling a cry. More shots followed, then silence fell heavy as the gathering dusk. Hours crawled past. Karen kept the fire built up, its light a beacon in the darkness. She jumped at every sound. The crack of frost-split wood, the cry of a night bird, the whisper of wind through pine boughs. Her prayers became a constant murmur, "Please, Lord, please bring him home safe." Just when despair threatened to overwhelm her, 3 distinct knocks sounded at the door. Karen hurried to unbar it, then gasped at the sight that greeted her. Liam stood swaying in the doorway, one eye swollen shut and blood crusted at the corner of his mouth. His coat was torn, and he held himself stiffly, as if every movement caused pain. "My God," Karen breathed, helping him inside. "What happened?" Liam stumbled to a chair, grimacing as he lowered himself into it. "Ambush," he managed. "Railroad men caught me loading supplies, said I was trespassing on company land." He touched his split lip gingerly. "Cray showed up, arrested me for disturbing the peace. Those devils," Karen hissed. She hurried to fetch water and clean rags. "How did you get away?" "Some folks in town still believe in justice," Liam said. "Miller's wife brought me food in the jail, slipped me a file with it. Reverend Thompson created a distraction while I made my way out the back." He attempted a smile that turned into a wince. "Seems not everyone's taken in by railroad money." Karen began cleaning his wounds with trembling hands. "You shouldn't have gone. I told you it was too dangerous." Her voice caught. "What if they'd killed you?" "Had to be done," Liam said simply. He caught her wrist gently as she dabbed at a cut above his eye. "Karen, look at me." She met his gaze, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'd take worse than this to keep you and the little one safe," he said softly. "Much worse." Karen's hand stilled against his cheek. "Don't say such things," she whispered. "I couldn't bear it if—" She broke off, turning away to wring out the bloodied cloth. Liam watched her move about the cabin, gathering supplies to tend his injuries. Despite his battered state, a warmth spread through his chest at her obvious concern. When she returned with bandages and a pot of Auntie May's healing salve, he submitted to her ministrations without protest. Karen worked in silence, cleaning each cut and bruise with careful attention. Her touch was gentle but thorough as she spread the pungent salve over the worst of the damage. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, studying his face with worried eyes. "You need rest," she said firmly, "and food. The stew's been simmering all day." Liam started to protest that he could serve himself, but Karen was already ladling the rich broth into a bowl. She brought it to him with a chunk of cornbread, then stood watching until he began to eat. Outside, snow had begun falling again, soft and steady. The cabin felt snug against the growing storm, filled with warmth and the savory smell of stew. As Liam ate, Karen moved about, banking the fire and setting things in order for the night. When she finally settled in her chair by the hearth, one hand resting on her belly, Liam noticed tears gleaming in her eyes again. "What troubles you?" he asked softly. Karen was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance. "I've been so afraid," she admitted. "All day, imagining the worst. And then, when you came back hurt," she drew a shaky breath, "I realized I couldn't bear to lose you too." Liam set aside his empty bowl, choosing his words carefully. "The Lord brought us together for a purpose," he said. "I aim to see it through, whatever comes." Karen nodded, wiping her eyes. Then she smiled faintly as the baby kicked. "Someone else is awake," she said. "Would you like to feel?" Liam moved his chair closer, placing his hand where she indicated. The strong movement beneath his palm made him catch his breath in wonder. "Little one's active tonight," Karen said softly. Then in an even lower voice, as if speaking to the child, "It's all right now. We're not alone anymore. We have someone watching over us." Liam's heart swelled at her words. Despite his aching body and the threat still looming, he felt a deep sense of rightness. This woman and her unborn child had brought meaning back to his solitary life. Whatever the railroad men planned, whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with renewed purpose. The snow continued falling outside, muffling all sound except the quiet crack of burning logs. Karen hummed softly, one of her mother's hymns, while Liam's eyes grew heavy with exhaustion and healing sleep. In that peaceful moment, the day's violence seemed far away, unable to touch the sanctuary they'd built together. Finally, Karen insisted that Liam take her bed near the fire, refusing his protests that he could manage on his pallet by the door. "You need proper rest to heal," she said firmly, helping him settle onto the soft furs. "I'll keep watch tonight." Too weary to argue further, Liam allowed himself to be tended to. As he drifted towards sleep, he felt Karen's gentle touch smoothing his hair back from his forehead. Her whispered prayer followed him into dreams. "Lord, keep him safe. Keep us all safe." Karen sat in her chair by the fire, one hand resting protectively over her child while she watched Liam sleep. Despite her fear and anger at what had been done to him, she felt an unfamiliar peace settling over her. They were not alone in their struggle. God had given them each other, and somehow that would be enough. Morning light crept reluctantly through the frost-covered windows of Liam's cabin. Karen stood at the rough-hewn table, methodically folding clean cloths into neat squares. Her fingers trembled slightly as she worked, betraying the worry that had settled deep in her bones. The railroad men's threats echoed in her mind. They would return, of that she was certain. Men like that never simply gave up what they wanted. She glanced at Liam, who dozed fitfully in the chair by the hearth, his bruised face testament to their ruthlessness. "We need more wood," she murmured, mostly to herself. The winter showed no signs of loosening its grip, and the woodpile had dwindled faster than expected. Liam stirred at her words, wincing as he straightened in the chair. "I'll see to it." "You'll do no such thing," Karen protested, watching him struggle to his feet. "You can barely walk." "Wood needs chopping all the same." His voice was quiet but firm. He retrieved his axe from its place by the door, each movement careful and measured against the pain. Karen knew better than to argue further. Instead, she turned her attention back to her preparations. Something inside her, mother's intuition perhaps, told her the child would come soon. She'd been gathering supplies for days. Clean linens, swaddling cloths, the healing herbs Auntie May had left. She set a pot of broth to simmer, adding dried vegetables and the last of the venison. The steady rhythm of the axe outside provided a counterpoint to her work. though each muffled grunt of pain that carried through the walls made her heart clench. By afternoon, dark clouds had gathered, threatening more snow. Karen's back ached fiercely as she moved about the cabin, but she ignored it, focusing on her tasks. The first sharp pain caught her mid-stride as she carried water from the barrel. The tin cup clattered to the floor. Water splashed across the planks as Karen gripped the edge of the table, breathing hard. When the pain eased, she straightened slowly, one hand pressed to her swollen belly. "Not yet," she whispered, "please, not yet." But her body had other plans. The pains returned with increasing frequency as evening approached. Karen paced the cabin, trying to remember Auntie May's instructions about walking through the early stages of labor. Liam returned from his woodcutting, arms full of split logs. He took one look at her face and dropped the wood by the hearth. "It's time?" Karen nodded, unable to speak as another contraction gripped her. Liam's strong hand steadied her, guiding her to lean against him until the pain passed. "What do you need?" His voice was calm, though his eyes betrayed his concern. "Water," she gasped, "and the birthing supplies in my trunk." Liam moved with purpose, gathering the items she'd prepared. He laid out clean cloths near the fire to warm them, positioned her bed closer to the hearth, and filled several buckets with fresh water. All the while, he murmured prayers under his breath, asking for guidance and protection. The hours that followed tested them both. Karen's labor pains grew stronger as night deepened. She alternated between pacing and resting, clinging to Liam's arm when the contractions became overwhelming. He supported her weight without complaint despite his own injuries, speaking soft words of encouragement. "You're stronger than you know," he told her during a particularly difficult moment. "The Lord is with us." Karen wanted to believe him, but as midnight approached and her strength began to fade, fear crept in. "I can't," she sobbed after an especially painful contraction. "I can't do this alone." "You're not alone." Liam's voice was firm. "I'm right here. We'll see this through together." He helped her walk another circuit of the cabin, supporting most of her weight now. When she could no longer stay upright, he eased her onto the bed, propping her up with every pillow and blanket he could find. The hours blurred together in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Karen lost track of how many times she cried out, how many prayers were whispered in the darkness. Liam never left her side, wiping her brow with cool cloths, offering sips of water, holding her hands when she needed to push. Finally, as the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Karen felt the final urge to push. Liam positioned himself to catch the baby, his hands steady despite his obvious nervousness. "I see the head," he announced, voice thick with emotion. "One more push, Karen. You can do this." Gathering her remaining strength, Karen bore down with everything she had. The pain peaked, then suddenly released as her child slipped into Liam's waiting hands. For one terrifying moment, silence filled the cabin. Then a lusty cry split the air, the most beautiful sound Karen had ever heard. Tears streamed down her face as Liam laid the squalling infant on her chest. "A boy," he said softly, his own eyes glistening. "A strong, healthy boy." Karen couldn't speak through her tears as she cradled her son, counting his tiny fingers and toes. Liam worked quickly to clean them both up, his touch gentle as he wrapped the baby in a warm blanket. The sun had fully risen by the time everything was settled. Karen lay propped up in the freshly made bed, her son nursing contentedly at her breast. Liam sat nearby, unable to take his eyes off the tiny being he'd helped bring into the world. "God has not abandoned me," Karen whispered, breaking the peaceful silence. "I thought he had, after everything that happened. But he led me here, to this place. To you." Liam reached out to touch the baby's downy head with reverent fingers. "May I hold him?" Karen carefully transferred the swaddled infant to his arms. Liam cradled the boy as if he were made of spun glass, wonder written across his weathered features. Looking at them together, this strong mountain man holding her newborn son with such tenderness, Karen felt something shift in her heart. The walls she'd built around herself since her husband's death began to crumble. "You've given me more than safety," she said softly, watching Liam rock her child. "You've given me a chance to believe again. In goodness. In God's mercy." She reached out to touch his arm. "In love." Liam's eyes met hers, full of emotion he couldn't express. Instead, he carefully returned the baby to her arms and knelt beside the bed. Together, they watched the sunrise paint the cabin walls gold, their tiny family complete in the peaceful morning light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor as Karen cradled her newborn son. 3 days had passed since his birth. 3 days of quiet joy, of learning his tiny features, of watching Liam's gentle way with the infant. But their peace shattered when a boy from town arrived, breathless at their door. Deputy Craze called a hearing, the youngster announced, handing Liam a crumpled notice. Tomorrow morning at the church, about the spring. Karen's arms tightened around her baby. Liam read the paper silently, his jaw clenching. "You're in no condition to travel," he said firmly, pressing a coin into the boy's hand and sending him on his way. "If we don't appear, we forfeit," Karen replied, her voice hoarse but determined. She shifted the baby to one arm and struggled to sit up straighter. "If we don't stand, our son has no future." "You've barely recovered," Liam protested, moving to steady her. "The trail's treacherous and the church is cold." "Then we'll bring extra blankets," Karen met his concerned gaze. "This isn't just about us anymore." Liam ran a hand through his beard, conflict clear on his face. Finally, he nodded. "We'll leave at first light, but you'll ride in the sled, well bundled, and we'll stop if you need rest." They spent the evening preparing. Karen nursed the baby frequently, knowing tomorrow would disrupt his routine. Liam gathered their warmest blankets and carefully loaded the sled with hay for cushioning. He also cleaned his rifle and tucked it under the seat, not a threat but a reminder that they weren't defenseless. Karen barely slept, listening to her son's soft breathing beside her. In the deepest part of night, she heard Liam praying by the fire. "Lord, give us wisdom. Give us strength. Protect this child and his mother." Dawn brought bitter cold. Liam helped Karen into the sled, tucking blankets around her and the baby until only their faces showed. The infant stayed remarkably quiet as they set out, lulled by the gentle motion and his mother's warmth. The journey seemed endless. Every jolt sent pain through Karen's still tender body, but she refused to complain. Liam walked beside the mule, checking on them frequently. When they finally reached town, the streets were already busy with people heading toward the church. Whispers spread as they passed. Some women crossed themselves at the sight of Karen with her newborn. Others pointed at Liam's presence beside them. "Shameless," someone muttered. "Poor widow," another voice countered. "At least the mountain man's standing by her." The church had been hastily converted into a courtroom. Wooden benches faced the pulpit, where a table now served as the judge's desk. Railroad men in fine coats sat near the front, their clean boots and pressed suits a stark contrast to the townspeople's worn clothing. Deputy Cray lounged near them, smirking as Liam helped Karen inside. She clutched her son closer, grateful for the blanket's shelter from unfriendly eyes. They found seats near the back, where Liam could watch the door while supporting Karen. Judge Harrison entered, a circuit judge known for fairness, though his tired eye suggested the railroad's influence weighed heavily. He called the room to order, his gavel echoing against the church's high ceiling. "Case regarding water rights to Briggs Spring," he announced. "Railroad interests versus Widow Briggs." He peered at Karen over his spectacles. "I understand you've recently given birth, Mrs. Briggs. This couldn't wait?" "No, Your Honor." Karen's voice quivered but held steady. "My son's future cannot wait." The railroad's lawyer rose smoothly. "We sympathize with Mrs. Briggs's condition, but progress cannot be delayed. The spring lies along our proposed route. The town's growth depends on reliable water for steam engines." "I have my husband's deed," Karen interrupted, earning a sharp look from the judge. Liam helped her stand, supporting her elbow as she approached the bench. The spring was legally claimed and recorded. The lawyer smiled thinly. "A claim filed by a dead man, witnessed by no one of standing, and now we find her living with a mountain man of questionable reputation." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Karen felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could speak, her baby began to fuss. The small sound echoed in the sudden quiet. Instead of hiding the child, Karen adjusted the blanket to show his face. "This is why I'm here," she declared, voice stronger now. My husband's choices brought me grief, but his last good act was claiming that spring for his child's inheritance. I have the deed, signed and witnessed, found where dishonest men hid it." Deputy Cray stood abruptly. "You can't prove—" "The papers were properly filed," Karen continued, speaking over him. "Ask your clerk. 3 days ago, we registered them officially." The judge leafed through documents before him, frowning. The filing appears correct, though some might question the timing and circumstances of their discovery. He looked pointedly at Liam, who had moved to stand protectively behind Karen. "And your connection to this man? The town has concerns about his influence." Karen felt Liam tense behind her. Without hesitation, she reached back and took his hand, turning to face the crowded church. Gasps and whispers erupted at her bold gesture. "He is my witness," she announced clearly. "My protector. When others would have left me to die in the snow, he offered shelter. When others mocked or threatened, he stood firm. He found the stolen deed at risk to himself, asking nothing in return." She lifted her chin. "If this town questions his character, then it questions mine as well." The baby chose that moment to let out a lusty cry. Karen rocked him gently, but didn't back down from the judge's steady gaze. "The spring belongs to my son. No amount of railroad money changes that truth." Silence fell heavy as a winter blanket. The railroad men exchanged glances. Deputy Cray's face darkened with barely contained rage. The townspeople waited, breath held, as Judge Harrison removed his spectacles and polished them slowly. Liam's hand tightened on Karen's, warming her cold fingers. Together they stood, their shadow stretching long across the church floor, waiting for the judge to speak. Note: stopping here as requested, having covered all the outlined events up to the moment before the verdict. The text includes Karen's recovery, the news arrival, the journey to town, and the courtroom confrontation, culminating in her public declaration of Liam as her protector. Judge Harrison's fingers drummed against the worn wood of the pulpit-turned bench. His eyes darted between the railroad men's polished buttons and Karen's trembling form. The silence stretched thin as winter ice. "The railroad's needs must be considered," he began slowly. "Progress demands—" "If it please the court." Circuit Preacher Miles rose from his seat, his aged voice carrying clear through the church. "I witnessed the filing of that deed myself 3 days past. The claim is valid and lawful under both God's eyes and man's law." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several farmers nodded, their weather-worn faces showing support for the first time. Deputy Cray sprang to his feet, face flushed. "Your Honor, consider the source of these papers. This mountain man," he jabbed a finger toward Liam, "living alone up there like some wild creature. Who knows what else he's stolen or hidden away? He has no standing here." Karen's cheeks flushed hot. Clutching her baby closer, she pushed herself upright, swaying slightly. Liam moved to steady her, but she stood on her own strength. "This man may not wear a badge," she declared, voice ringing with emotion, "but he gave me dignity when no one else would. You can't imagine what you're doing to me right now, asking me to deny the only true friend left to me." Tears glimmered in her eyes, but her spine remained straight. "He protected me when others would have left me to die. He defended my child's rights when others would have stolen them." The room fell silent, save for her baby's soft cooing. Judge Harrison removed his spectacles, studying Karen's face for a long moment. Finally, he cleared his throat. "The deed is properly filed, the claim stands." He raised his voice over the railroad men's protests. "This court finds in favor of Mrs. Briggs. The spring remains with her land, for her child's inheritance." The railroad men stormed out, boots striking hard against the floorboards. Deputy Cray followed, face dark with fury. But townfolk began approaching Karen and Liam, offering shy smiles and tentative congratulations. Liam's bruised hand found Karen's shoulder, squeezing gently. They shared a look of quiet triumph, while their son slept peacefully, unaware that his future had just been secured. The journey back to the cabin felt lighter, despite the cold wind whipping across the valley. Patches of winter sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the snow-covered slopes in gleaming silver. Karen held her son close, wrapped snugly in layers of wool while Liam guided the mule with steady hands. Inside the warmth of the cabin, Karen watched as Liam carefully placed her husband's deed into a sturdy wooden box. His movements were gentle, reverent almost, as he set it beside the hearth where it would stay dry and safe. The papers that had caused so much strife now seemed such simple things, just ink and paper that would secure her child's future. Karen settled into the rocking chair, nursing her son while afternoon light streamed through the window. Above, she could hear Liam's boots on the roof, the steady rhythm of his work as he patched weak spots before the next storm. His deep voice carried down, humming fragments of an old hymn that made her smile. Amazing Grace, though he seemed to know only every other line. When evening came, they shared a simple supper of venison stew and cornbread. The baby slept peacefully in his makeshift cradle, tiny fingers curled into fists. Karen's eyes glistened in the firelight as she looked across the table. "Thank you, Liam," she said softly, "for everything." Liam ducked his head, uncomfortable with praise. "Reckon I never thought the Lord had more in mind for me than living alone up here. Thought that was my lot." He paused, running a hand through his beard, but seems he had other plans. The fire crackled in comfortable silence. Karen's heart thundered in her chest as she gathered her courage. "Would you consider staying?" she asked gently. "Not just as our guardian, but—" She drew a steadying breath. "As family." Liam's eyes widened. Without a word, he rose and knelt beside her chair. His calloused hand reached out, covering the baby's tiny fist where it rested against her arm. The touch was as light as a feather, full of wonder and possibility. The news of Karen's court victory and new baby spread through town like wildfire. Over the next few days, a steady stream of visitors made their way up the snowy path to Liam's cabin, now their cabin. They came bearing gifts wrapped in cloth and warm wishes in their hearts. Mrs. Peterson from the general store brought a bolt of soft cotton for swaddling clothes. The miller's wife arrived with a sack of fresh ground flour, and 3 men from church hauled up seasoned firewood on their sleigh. Each visitor marveled at how the mountain man's austere dwelling had transformed. Dried herbs now hung from the rafters, and tiny clothes warmed by the fire filled the air with the sweet scent of soap. When Auntie May arrived, her presence brought a deeper sense of blessing. She cradled the infant in her weathered arms, whispering ancient Cherokee words of protection and strength. Her prayer filled the cabin with something holy, a bridge between worlds, between past and future. Karen watched through tears as the wise woman touched the baby's forehead with sacred herbs, blessing him in 2 traditions. "This child carries hope," Auntie May said simply, her dark eyes warm with approval as she glanced between Karen and Liam. "He will know both strength and tenderness." As evening settled over the valley, the visitors departed one by one, leaving the small family in peaceful solitude. Karen rocked slowly in her chair, the baby sleeping against her chest. The familiar creak of wood matched the rhythm of her heart, now fuller than she'd ever imagined possible. Liam sat nearby, Karen's family Bible open on his knee. He'd found it carefully wrapped in her trunk, and now his deep voice filled the cabin as he read by lamplight. The words of Psalms flowed like honey, his rough frontier accent somehow making them more genuine, more immediate. The baby stirred and Karen stroked his downy head. "He has a father now," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A real father." Liam's reading faltered. He looked up, firelight catching the moisture in his eyes. "And I," he said hoarsely, "I finally have a home." Together they bowed their heads in prayer, the small family united in gratitude. Outside, snow fell silently, but its threat was gone. The storm that had once forced them together now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by the promise of spring and new beginnings. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.